Well, good morning, everybody. This is Jim Manker, Director of Business Development for the CSAC Finance Corporation, and one of the partners that is bringing you today's webinar. Thanks for your time and joining us. We're happy and pleased to celebrate our relationship, which spans a couple of decades with Nationwide, and excited about who they're bringing to the table today as well, American Century Investments. We're also thankful for our partnership with the Institute for Local Government. They're the host today for this webinar, and you'll hear my colleague Randy K. Stevens in a few minutes talking about the rules of this webinar, how to ask questions, et cetera, et cetera. But I just wanted to welcome you today. And again, remind you of our strong partnership with Nationwide here at CSAC. So glad to have their expert panels with us today. And now I'm going to kick it over to Randy. Thank you, Randy K. Stevens from ILG.
Thank you, Jim. So glad to have everybody joining us today. And thank you to our friends and colleagues at both Nationwide and American Century. And thank you, CSAC Finance Corp and Jim for bringing us all together. ILG is proud to help host this webinar from a tech front. And I just want to remind attendees that all questions are welcome. Please go ahead and use the question and answer box. And with that, I'll go ahead and share today's current webinar overview. The COVID-19 recession has had a tremendous impact on the economy, led by record-breaking job losses and upended business operations. The near-term outlook is grim, but there is optimism that a recovery is on the way. Still, uncertainty looms over the outlook, depending on virus infections and potential medical solutions. There remain several potential paths forward for the economy, both to the upside and to the downside. Well, today we are going to hear from several experts. Steve Ebert from Nationwide Financial, Jeff Hornerman with American Century Investments, Mike Brode, also with American Century, and Ben Ayers with Nationwide Financial. Following the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. All questions are welcome. Comments, suggestions, please go ahead and type them into your question box. And then ILG will also share some tools and resources available to you. Just as a reminder for those who are looking at the presentation on a screen, there's a box that actually invites you to list your questions. Please use that. Throughout the duration of the presentation, we'll be marking the questions to ask during the Q&A section with the panelists. A little bit about the Institute for Local Government. We're proud to be your webinar host today. We are a nonprofit training and education affiliate for CSAC, as well as for the League of California Cities and Special Districts Association. We offer a number of programs and services related to leadership and governance, civics education and workforce, public engagement, sustainable communities. And we do that by providing education and training, technical assistance, capacity building, and convening support to local governments throughout California. We invite you to look at our free resources related to COVID-19, leadership, and of course, engaging your public as we endure this pandemic. I'd also like to share the resources available from our affiliate partners, including CSAC, which has a COVID-19 toolkit, the Special Districts Association, and the League as well. For right now, we're going to conduct a few brief short polls just to find out more about the audience and your experience. We're going to be asking you two questions. One, what type of agency you're with, and two, the type of role that you have. I've launched the poll. We're asking you if you are with a county, a city, a special district, a state agency, or a private corporate nonprofit partner. All right, we have almost all of our votes in, and it looks like we have a majority of county participants with several from our private or corporate or nonprofit partners. We'll go ahead and close that poll and share those results with you. Thank you for voting over in that poll. And now I will go ahead and ask that second question. Tell us about your role in local government. Are you staff, elected official, consultant, or some other type of position? Looks like we have mostly staff with some folks marking other. So I'll go ahead and close that poll and share those results so you can see them too. Right. Thank you for taking part in those polls. And now we're going to get started. I would like to invite our partners to go ahead and kick this presentation off. And with that, I welcome Steve Ebert to go ahead and say a few words about our expert team here today.
Great. Thank you, Randy Kay. It's my pleasure. Again, my name is Steve Ebert. On behalf of Nationwide, I want to thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. And as Jim said, we have a long-standing relationship with CSAC. I want to thank them for that partnership. Thank Jim personally for his friendship and all the work he does on our behalf. And he's a great partner. So with that, again, Nationwide is very committed to California. We have the privilege and honor to serve 34 of the 58 counties and in retirement plans, as well as the state plan, California Savings Plus, as well as over 150 other cities, special districts, et cetera. So we have a large presence in California, and it's a pleasure for us to be here and honor to be talking to you today. I'd like to thank Mike Jackson and American Century Investments for helping put together today's presentation. American Century is a long partner of Nationwide. They manage money in retirement plans. Many of you may use American Century Investments in your lineup for your participants. Again, it's a pleasure to be working with them today. And I'd like to go and kick things off and introduce today's panelists and presenters. We have two individuals from American Century Investments, Jeff Horniman, who is a portfolio manager for American Century. He's also a biotechnology analyst. He co-manages the U.S. Small Cap Growth Fund and is a CFA charter holder. Joining Jeff is Mike Rode. Mike Rode is the Vice President and Senior Client Portfolio Manager for American Century. He's a member of the Global Value Equity Group, And it's a pleasure having Jeff and Mike here today. They'll kick things off and spend the first 20 or so minutes talking a little about today's presentation and COVID-19 and what's going on there. After Jeff and Mike, we'll then hear from Ben Ayers. Ben Ayers is a senior economist for Nationwide Insurance. He's responsible for supporting the company's forecasting and microeconomic analyst functions. So after that, after Mike and Jeff, Ben's going to take a deeper dive and see how COVID-19 impacted the economy, both at a macro level, but also in California specifically. So with that, I won't take any more time. I'll turn the time over to Jeff and Mike to get things started.
Great, thanks, Steve, and thanks to Nationwide, CSAC, and the Institute for Local Government for having us on today. So Steve mentioned over the next 15 to 20 minutes, Jeff Horniman and I will be discussing COVID-19 more from a healthcare perspective. We'll probably touch on a couple of stocks, but the real goal for this call today is to get everyone caught up as to what's happened with the COVID-19 virus, where we are today, which is changing by the day for sure, and then what the future may look like in terms of treatments, a vaccine, a potential for a second wave in the fall, and more. So just a disclaimer right up front, everything we'll discuss today will be our opinion from an investment and a science perspective. This isn't official American Century Investments position. People may disagree, but I think it's pretty fair to say that Jeff Horniman is very well informed on this topic. So Jeff, welcome. Yeah, actually, if Randy, you could go to the first slide, that would be great. But Jeff, thank you. So going back to the beginning of the year, which was just 6 months ago, kind of feels like a lifetime ago, what were your first thoughts when you heard about the coronavirus, and how has that position changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, actually, originally I thought it was less than serious. I even talked to our consumer analyst, Shannon Berry, on the team and told her it was probably pretty bad flu or something like that. It did not take long for that opinion to change. Once China began closing down territories, such a large percent population territories, we really sat up and took notice. We had the opportunity to talk to some experts, some physician experts in the field, and we talked to one that basically said what was happening in Wuhan could happen anywhere in the world, and the only way to stop it would be to do what China was doing in terms of shutting down areas. And then as it migrated to northern Italy, you saw the deadliness there carried across from one country to the next. It was really time to get very concerned about it. And frankly, at that time, the U.S. equity markets hadn't really responded. And it really took Rudy Gobert and Tom Hanks being diagnosed to make it real in terms of most Americans' eyes. So, here we are now, more than 2 million cases, more than 110,000 mortality. And we know this is different from the flu, right? This is causing direct damage to the lungs. And even asymptomatic patients have been shown to have what is called ground glass opacity, or damage to the lungs that shows up on X-ray when the air sacs filled with liquid. So, there's no reports yet of healing happening to these people, which is a little bit scary. And we're seeing widespread blood clotting, especially in the lungs. So, we continue to learn more about the impacts of the body, and, there's plenty more to learn. But based on what we know right now, this virus is not something I would want to be messing with.
Yeah, really sobering numbers for sure. And I didn't realize that people who don't show symptoms of the virus may still have lung damage. So definitely continue to wear a mask. So let's talk about this first slide. We've heard a lot about flattening of the curve. Jeff, could you talk a little bit about how the various curves around the world have played out over the last few months?
Yeah, so this is just a timeline of new cases per day in a couple different countries. Any one of these countries at one point here was a top area of concern from around the world. And you can see, we're still learning a lot about the virus, but one thing that we really have learned, and we know, is that isolation, call it social distancing, call it a lockdown, whatever you want, it works. In just about every case, you can see a pretty quick reduction in new cases, followed by a slowing in hospitalizations and mortality. China being the most dramatic in terms of the government mandated shutdown, but it caused a fall off in new cases. So developed markets at this point, especially Europe, are pretty much past the peak, and it's just kind of further proof isolation works.
Yeah, it's interesting. You look at Europe and Asia, but when you look at the U.S. and Sweden, those curves look very different than the others. Neither have rolled over yet, at least, like those other countries. So any thoughts on why that could be?
Yeah, you're right. New cases in the U.S. never got meaningfully below 20,000 a day, like you saw in Europe, where continuously downward movement, and Sweden new case growth hasn't dropped off. Sweden did not enforce a lockdown or any isolation. They tried to shelter the economy by using a herd immunity strategy. Just let everybody get the virus, right? It has not gone well. Their mortality per capita is much higher than their Scandinavian peers, and the economy is still impacted. In the U.S., we've had more or less a lax approach to this, and it's a non-uniform strategy. It's a state-by-state basis. And geographically, we're a big country. So you saw New York rise up and fall down, and during that fall down time, other areas have heated up. That's why we haven't seen the countrywide fall in cases. There's some other stuff at play too. Daily tests have gone from essentially 0 to 500,000 a day, and still growing. So we're catching cases that we just quite frankly weren't before. And now that economies are opening, we're seeing a significant pickup in cases. And that kind of makes you wonder, brings up a big question, like how bad is this rebound really?
Yeah, that for sure is the key question. And it seems like the data here in the U.S. are getting worse by the day. But before we hit on that point, let's touch on emerging markets. If you could actually move to the next slide, Randy, please. Thanks. So as you can see on this slide, the new case growth in the emerging markets is accelerating. So Jeff, any thoughts on why this could be?
Yeah, there's no way to say for sure, but you think about at the very beginning stages of the virus spread, developed markets have a lot more interconnection between each other, right? And the restrictions in travel between countries that were put in helped slow the virus and it spread between countries. And that probably kept it from initially moving to these emerging markets. In the meantime, the seeds were already planted in the US, they're already planted in continental Europe. So it's just a little bit more slow movement, but no place is immune. You can see that. The other thing to look at is you look at it on a map basis, and the Northern Hemisphere is the one that seems to be past their peak, and the Southern Hemisphere is coming up now. So there might be something to moving into a colder season in the Southern Hemisphere, which means more transmissibility. We're a long way from knowing if that's for real or not.
Yeah, still so much to learn for sure. All right, well, let's move back to that key question, right? Looking forward, this potential for a second wave here in the U.S. Just a few weeks ago, the thought was that summer we'd see a meaningful decline, followed by a risk of a second wave in the fall. But over the last few days, really, we've seen a significant increase in new cases. The governor of Texas said yesterday that the state is facing a massive outbreak. So this has clearly rattled financial markets and the hopes or prospects for a V-shaped recovery, at least as of right now. So, as economies and different states here in the U.S. continue to reopen, should we expect to see a resurgence in cases?
Yeah, probably. So again, once we start making projections, you just kind of understand there's a lot of uncertainty still, and we're trying to do our best to use information to make educated guess. But, there's always been concern about what happens when you take your foot off the brakes of the economy and people get moving and closer together again. And if you think about it, when the virus came to the United States, it was a handful of cases, right? We're talking about dozens. The president made his first comments about the virus. There was 15 cases, and it was only a couple of weeks, and we were at 30,000 cases a day. And we never got them down, and we're back above those 30,000 per day levels due to acceleration now in California, Arizona, Texas, Florida, among others. If you go to the next slide in the presentation, you'll see what some of the stuff that we're looking at that explains this. We look at a lot of different data sets that kind of track the reopening of the U.S. economy, and this one is kind of one that is a catch-all. It's the Dallas Fed Movement and Engagement Index. It's using cell phone tracking data, seeing how many people, what percentage of people are outside of the house, how long they're outside of the house, where they're going. It's kind of all rolled into an index. You can see a steep drop into April and recovery since then. You see on the news or something like that, a beach that's packed, bars that are packed, people worrying about that. Even with that, reopening is still not really that open. We're nowhere near normal levels of activity. Schools are still out. People are still working from home. There's a lot of people still strictly social distancing. And if you go to the next slide, you can drill down on a state-by-state level. We're kind of looking at seeing if there's anything explanatory about this surge in cases to go along with the rebound in activity. And we drill down and we look at the fastest growing cases in the fastest growing states. And it tends to be the ones that are closer to normal activity. And, there's no hard and fast rule like with most things about the virus, but once activity gets back to about half of where it was in a state, that's where you get to a tipping point in case growth. This is definitely different than what I had expected early on as we were talking about a fall resurgence. The rationale for me was that if you follow this path of recovery, it's going to be until late August, early September before we even got back to a normal pace of activity or engagement. That's when the kids are going back to school and other things that bring people closer together. And it turns out, unfortunately, that is not the case. It looks like there is something below normal activity, a level where it really incentivizes new case growth. So, this is different from what we've seen in Europe to date. There's gradual reopenings all over Europe and little case growth. And even within the United States, states that have opened and have been open for a while, not all of them are showing a big surge. So we still got a lot to learn. But when you look at the states that have the faster case growth, some are showing increases in hospitalization, some are not. It's still moderate. So, a couple of things to think about on the positive side as well.
Yeah, these charts are really striking. If you look at the the bottom left, California. So that you're seeing a growing case count, but the activity level as measured by that mobility index isn't as high as some of the other states where you're seeing a lot of growth. So what are your thoughts? Why could that be?
Well, and the first thing to think about, it's a big state, bigger than most other states in the country. And even if you compare it to those Western European curves, only France and Spain have any more land mass than California. So you can't paint it with a broad brush. Different areas in a state are going to act differently from one another. Here's another data set we like on the next slide. It gives you daily information about people that are booking and attending seats in restaurants on Open Table. San Diego in the dark green, clearly more activity than San Francisco in the light green. Maybe this is an indicator for why you're seeing faster case growth in Southern California and not Northern California yet. The other thing to think about, California is a border state. And as you've seen in Texas and Arizona and California, bordering Mexico, which you saw in previous slides, still dealing with pretty high new case growth. So it's a good bet, can't be proven yet, but we're seeing importation into those states, especially on the southern border. Look at LA County, for instance, more total cases than any county in the US, but even more interesting is Imperial County, low population, but its per capita case count is 3 times that of LA County.
Yeah, it's all really interesting stuff. So I guess, if we do start, if this is the start of a second wave or a reacceleration of that first wave, do you think it could be as bad as the original in terms of hospitalizations and death? I mean, how does this differ than a few months ago?
Yeah, so a couple of things on the positive and on the negative side. One thing that we know, the virus is still the same. It's still deadly, still dangerous, still contagious. So I do have some points of hope where I hope maybe it's not as bad as it was originally in terms of mortality and hospitalization and severity. We haven't seen new case counts flow through to hospitalizations or death yet in the same numbers that we've seen new cases come in, and certainly not at the same rate they were in March when this was first breaking out. But again, these are lagging indicators. You see the case counts, then the hospitalizations, then the mortality if you're testing properly. So we're at a critical juncture. We're going to find out in the next couple weeks if this higher case count is really going to lead to more severity. And that's a little concerning. I think we might be looking at the negative data in the next couple weeks. In the spring, we had social distancing, and that really put a stop to the spread in the northeastern part of the country. If that doesn't happen now, I'm not sure what flows. On the other side of the ledger, reasons for hope, we've got the testing capacity, right? If we had the same positive case count in March as we have now, or the same amount of testing in March as we have now, 30,000 cases actually would have been more like 150,000 cases. So even though the numbers are high now, I'm not sure that's a dead set indication that we're in a worse position now than we were. And you see clusters, you hear about clusters being discovered. That's not a bad thing. We were not finding clusters in March. When you find a cluster, then you can stop it from further spread, right? I think in general, people are just better educated. They're keeping themselves safer now than they were when they didn't even know the virus was circulating in late February, early March. Hand washing, mask wearing, you name it, is more routine now than it was. And then finally, and importantly, treatment is better. A few months ago, we had no experience treating these patients. Doctors have learned a lot. There were 0 therapeutic options at the beginning of the year. Now there's at least something out there available that we know works.
Yeah, I think it's a good segue to talk about current treatments that are on the market. What does that landscape look like today?
Right. So there's 2 treatment options that have been given emergency approval by the FDA in the United States. Both basically originally showed promise in a petri dish. They could kill the virus in a lab setting. In human use, we've seen mixed results. Gilead's remdesivir showed a positive impact in patients, in both in terms of slowing mortality and getting people recovered faster. The other one, very high profile, is hydroxychloroquine, which got a lot of attention, but really has not proven out anything in clinical trials, and it's actually had its emergency approval removed. To be fair, when you repurpose old drugs, it's kind of what you're going to get. It's not going to be some big impact or some miracle cure. But the positive news is that in the next couple months, we're going to see another 200 or more clinical trial results looking at what could be effective here.
So 200 different trials with data coming in the near term. I think that helps explain the huge interest that we've seen in biotechnology stocks over the last couple of months. So of these 200 different trials, are there any that really stand out to you that look promising?
Yeah, there's two categories I would call out where I have the most hope. The first is antibody treatments. We know that when you take plasma from the blood of recovered patients and give it to current patients, it helps. That's because the antibodies are fighting the virus. We see the most promising programs at Regeneron. There's a handful of others where you're using a purpose-built, lab-developed antibody specified, a mix of them specified to neutralizing the virus. Could be used on a prophylactic basis or in a treatment basis. Those trials are just getting started. The second category is anti-inflammatories. When you get a patient to the most serious stages of the disease, it's no longer the virus that is killing them. It's the overreaction of their immune system. So we've seen just recently, like within the last 2 weeks, low dose steroids have a mortality benefit, a pretty decent one, for people that are on a ventilator or on oxygen. This is the very latest stages. Other anti-inflammatory drugs, newer ones, in other inflammatory diseases have shown pretty substantial improvements on steroids, and those are being trialed right now in these severe patients. So there's a chance that we improve even on this benefit you've seen from low-dose steroids.
Okay, so it sounds like this is new and emerging, and the pool of treatments is expanding for sure. But I think the holy grail is really a vaccine, right? Maybe just talk about the process for a vaccine to get approved. How long does it typically take from start to finish vaccine to come to market?
Yeah, vaccine development is pretty complicated, and there's a lot of reasons for that. They have among the lowest success rates of any drug class type out there. Over history, and this amazed me when I looked it up, the time from when a virus is isolated in a lab to being a vaccine averages 60 years. All right, now obviously there's a lot of very old data. Hopefully science has advanced since then, but the fastest ever to move from isolation to a product is 4 years, and that was mumps in 1967 to 1971. So, we'll see if a few months is enough time.
Yeah, let's hope we have a vaccine before 2080. That would be good. But I know that there's been a lot of speculation about a potential vaccine by the end of this year. That's definitely driven markets higher. If you look at the average, even the fastest time being 4 years, what do you think? Could we actually have something by the end of this year?
I would say the end of the year is definitely the optimistic case. But the regulatory agencies are being extremely flexible. Things take a long time because you got to cross all your T's and dot all your I's, and the agencies want to make sure that you're developing a safe and effective drug. The situation is a little different now. So FDA is allowing vaccines, the leaders, to move along the regulatory pathway real quickly. We're talking about moving from animal trials to human trials without all the normal data you would gather and submit to the agency. They've moved from phase 2 trials, from phase 1 to phase 2 trials without all the follow-up from phase 1, and that continues into phase 3. So we're moving along and kind of moving past some regulatory stuff that we would have had to deal with in a more normal situation. Now, there's a lot of hangups, a lot of things that could trip up any one of these. So we probably could spend an entire webinar on that. We'll spare you those details.
Definitely next time. But I guess sort of final question, of these vaccines that are out there right now, these companies are working on, are there any that really stand out to you?
Yeah, we really haven't seen much data, particularly in humans. Moderna is a small company. They have a high-profile program. And they've shown us some initial safety from a handful of patients in that phase 1. It is not as safe as a flu vaccine or something like that at this point. They've chosen a medium dose instead of the highest dose to kind of keep that risk down. We have seen that people inoculated with their vaccine are generating antibodies. And we also know that these antibodies can neutralize the virus in a lab setting. The key now for phase 3 is to see if those antibodies are effective at preventing an infection. Even if it only reduces the severity of an infection, you got to consider it a win at this point. We don't need perfection right out of the gate as long as you have something safe. So something else to think about. Moderna's type of vaccine, the way they're approaching this, has never been approved before. It's new technology. And that's the case for all of the 5 leading vaccines. They're not that they haven't ever had an approved product, but they're pretty new technology. This isn't your old style of vaccine.
Yeah, well, so much uncertainty. Well, Jeff, thanks. That was really informative. Just to kind of wrap it up, I'd say a couple points. COVID-19 is deadly serious. There's still so much we don't know about the virus, but we do know that social distancing, wearing a mask, washing your hands works. So definitely want to be vigilant on that front. The good news is that their testing has gotten better. There are hundreds of treatments on the horizon with some interesting candidates coming. We have potential for a vaccine. End of year is probably optimistic, but Moderna has probably the early lead there. So thanks again, and with that, I will turn it back to Randy.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the great information that Mike, Jeff, and Ben presented. We do have another presentation coming up, and this one's also by Ben. So Ben, if you would like to go ahead and get started, go ahead and please announce yourself, and looking forward to hearing from you.
All right. Thank you, Randy K. And good morning, everyone. And very interesting discussion on the medical impacts. I'm going to walk through some of the high-level economic impacts, focusing mainly on the labor market. We've seen a lot of changes in the economy over the last couple months, and a lot of that's been focused on the labor market. And that's where things really hit home for people. We focus on the labor market a lot because the more people go out and spend, the more they feel about spending, that's the better the whole economy does. So we're going to dive into some of the numbers, talk about some perspectives of what's happened so far, and then look a little bit into some of the specifics for the California area. So let's go to my first slide here. And what this shows is just how quickly the COVID-19 recession, that is now officially a recession according to the National Bureau of Economic Research as of the end of February, how quickly this has come on. What I'm showing is the total number of those weekly initial jobless claims we've heard a lot of reports about at the national level. And you can see really just in less than a 3-month time, we've had over 45 million initial jobless claims. You can actually add 1.5 million to that from a number that was released this morning. And, in that 3-month period, we've already surpassed all that we had from the 2007 to 2009 recession that was over 18 months long. So much more quickly, just out of nowhere, big impact on the labor market, huge impact on a lot of workers across the country, and show a little bit more on that in a second here. The next slide walks through a little bit of this at the state level. So we just talked about the national numbers, off the charts numbers, numbers we've never seen before from initial jobless claims. This tries to provide some perspective of how it looks at the state level. And what I've done is taken that number and put it as a share of the labor force in each state over across the last 3 months here. So you can see a pretty big dispersion. You look at the national level, very big numbers. A lot of states have seen big numbers as well, but some haven't, particularly those in the middle of the country where the shutdowns were not as stringent, not as long, and just not as effective as shutting down the economy in the middle of the country. A few to point out there, you see the ones that are at the top end, you see Kentucky, Georgia, so almost 60% of their labor force has applied for unemployment insurance over the past 3 months. That's unheard of. Now, some of those are probably folks that couldn't get in the system in the first couple of weeks and maybe reapplied, so maybe there's a little bit of inflating of these numbers, but very strong numbers in some of these states, and shows you the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on different states across the country. I'm looking for a second at California there. You see that at 28.7, yet again, very high number, a little bit higher than the national average across all the states here, but certainly reflecting a very big impact on the labor market in the local California area. The next slide just goes back to the national level and just shows again the unprecedented numbers that we saw particularly focused on the April decline in total non-farm payroll. We lost 20.5 million jobs in April. By comparison, we added about that many over the previous decade. So we wiped out a decade's worth of job growth in just 1 month as a result of the COVID-19 impact. I also kind of circle the Great Recession there. That was one of the big, huge impact at that point. You can see just how much that pales in comparison. Now, certainly the length of that was much longer, but certainly the numbers involved here with the COVID-19 recession of 2020 are just off the charts. Fortunately, we did bounce back. We did add 2.5 million jobs in May. That was much stronger than consensus expectations. We were expecting potentially further declines reported for May, and it kind of tells us things are getting back on the ground a little faster, particularly as we see many of the state and local economies across the country open up. We're seeing more activity, more people going out, and unfortunately, as highlighted in the previous presentation, unfortunately that means a bit more infections. So something we're keeping a very close eye on, because overarching all of this is still much of the uncertainty that we have on the medical front and what that means for the economy going forward. Typically, we would see things rebound. You see the economy pick up, get better, and move forward. But unfortunately, there certainly is that downside scenario of a resurgence of the virus either this summer or later this year, and it could cause more of a double dip for the economy than what we currently expect in our baseline. Shifting on to the next slide, which just shows a little more detail by sector. Here I'm looking just at the California data and not at the national level, but mainly it's because they pretty much mirror each other. What you're seeing at the national level is really what you're seeing across most states across the country, a very big hit to the service sector because of the economic shutdowns from March and April and May, and focus primarily on two sectors. Here looking at a recreation, so tourism sector, and then accommodation and food services, which is hotels and restaurants. You can see just from February to May, so just over a 3-month period, both those sectors within California shed almost half their jobs. So half the people that worked in those sectors lost their jobs over those 3 months. And this even includes the rebound that we saw, and particularly in those sectors, but other ones as well that we saw for May. You can see the comparison against the total private down 15%, very big number. But yet again, even below the recreation and the accommodation and food services, big impact on the service sector. We've seen a big impact on small businesses, those small restaurants, those small shops. Many of them have had to shut, potentially permanently. And a big issue that we're keeping an eye on is what's happening with the recovery in the service sector, because that's really where most of the job losses are occurring. I will point out you do see still pretty good job losses in manufacturing, construction, more of the goods producing sectors, 8-9%. That's still a very big hit over a 3-month time frame, but certainly not nearly as much as we see in some of the key service sectors that we're looking at here for the state of California. One final note on this slide, public government, which is just off the page, would be down about 7.6% over these 3 months in California, and all of that's happened at the local government level. Haven't seen any impact at the state or the federal level, but big job losses happening at the local government level. Certainly something to keep an eye on as we look ahead to what impact this is going to have on state and local budgets. A lot of discussion about the schools and those sort of things. So something that certainly is a risk down the road of further declines in local level government, because we've already seen a pretty big hit so far. Next slide, pull this out, really diving even further down and looking at the decline in payroll employment across the California Metropolitan Statistical area. So looking at the key cities and counties across the state. I only have data here through April. We don't have the May data here, so it even looks a little uglier because we're looking at the worst numbers as far as going from February to April. A couple trends that come out here. As you can see with the darker colors, with the bigger declines in employment, most of the bigger numbers on the coast. We see much larger job losses on the coast. You're looking at LA County down there, looking at the Bay Area, and all the way up to Santa Rosa. So big losses there. Even going further in, you see Sacramento with a pretty large decline at 15% up there as well. Generally, the Central Valley and some of the areas towards the middle of the state, away from the coast, those are still big losses, but not quite as large. You're talking about maybe half as a percent share of job losses, as you saw along the coast. So very big impact on the big cities, kind of mirrors, again, what we're seeing across the country, that the cities are taking the big impact of the job losses, particularly the largest cities that we see here with the service sectors. Shifting over to the other side of the employment coin, looking at the unemployment side of things. Here, shifting back to the national level, coming into COVID-19, we actually were at a 50-year low for the national unemployment rate. Very good numbers, and then suddenly everything shut down, and the unemployment shot up to the highest levels we've seen really since the end of the Great Depression. We jumped up to 14.5% at a national level. That did pull back a little bit in May, but still remaining in the teens. And we do expect these numbers to remain pretty high for a while. While we are expecting job growth to come back, it's still likely that by the end of the year, we'll still be down about 10 to 15 million jobs compared to where we started the year. So likely to see double-digit unemployment rates at the national level really for most of the year. We do think we'll see some improvement as we see the economies open up and see some more activity in the second half of this year. But this is going to take a long time for the economy to recover. And then it boils down to the state level and obviously down to the local level as well. Traditionally, it takes the economy about 30 months, so almost 3 years, to get back to that full level of peak employment that it started at before we went into a recession. And I think given the huge decline we've seen already and just the massive impacts we've seen across the country, it's likely to take longer this time. I think this is something that we'll be talking about several years from now, that there are still people that are out of jobs because of what happened this year. So unfortunately, a long tail to this and probably a long tail impact for the economy for years ahead. Shifting to the next slide, where I show this yet again down to the city level for the metropolitan statistical areas across California. These were the current unemployment levels as of April. You see double digits across the state. In fact, the lowest number I think we see on there is 12. So very high numbers. Yet again, this mirrors what's happening across the country. 43 of the 50 states set record high unemployment rates in April. So very high numbers across the state. You do see El Centro down there kind of sticks out, but I'll show in a second that unemployment was actually already pretty high there. It was already about 18%. So even though it's all the way up to 30, which really jumps out, yet again, more of the gains were happening along the coast than really inland from the Pacific coast there. And kind of reiterating that, looking at the next slide here, which just shows the increase in that unemployment rate. So kind of the mirror image of what we showed for the job numbers, where you saw the big increase from February to April. You see a 15.3% increase in LA County. That's off the charts. We've never seen an increase like that in any of these local areas, and it just kind of mirrors again the massive impact we're seeing. Yet again, the bigger increases did occur along the coast. Looking at LA there, looking at Salinas. The Bay Area did increase a lot, but actually not some of the peaks that we saw in some of the other counties and cities across the state. But still very big increases across the board. And yet again, emphasizing that all these numbers are very high. There is some relativeness to this where, like I said, the coastal areas probably are getting hit worse and probably will take a little longer to rebound because of that. But still very big impact really across the entire state. And yet again, emphasizing again, very big impact across the whole country. So shifting to the next slide. So how do we put this all together? We've seen just off the charts numbers from the job perspective. How do we put this together from a growth perspective? Well, as you can see here on the chart of a real gross domestic product growth, a very big impact in the second quarter. We're expecting an annualized decline of about 35% in the second quarter. It's by far the weakest quarter for growth that the U.S. economy has ever seen. Since World War II, the biggest quarterly decline has been about 10%. And you can see where it got pretty close to that in 2008 and 2009. So we're expecting a number 3 to 4 times that when you look ahead to the second quarter. So very high numbers that really pulls down growth for this year. We're expecting a total growth decline of about 7.6% for 2020 as a total. And that'd be the worst drop in the economy since 1946. So all these comparisons keep having to go back to World War II, going back to Great Depression, because that's just the huge impact that we're seeing on the economy. Fortunately, we do see a rebound, and particularly in the near term. We're quite optimistic about Q3, while obviously there is some concern about what's happening with the recent surge in the virus. It still looks like activity has picked up when we are coming off such a low base from the second quarter. We are expecting a pretty good growth rate for Q3. Our baseline assumption assumes that carries into the rest of the year and that we continue to see positive growth in Q4, and particularly because of what the Fed has done. If you look at the very low interest rate environment, you're thinking low mortgage rates, which we're very positive on where housing can go from here. We're thinking low financing rates for businesses as they look to invest and recover from this. And we're expecting a very stimulative environment for the economy coming out of this event, which leads us to much faster growth in 2021. We're expecting growth about 4 to 5% per quarter when you look ahead to 2021, and helping us to dig out of this hole. But yet again, as with the jobs numbers, likely to take multiple years until we fully get back to levels we saw pre-COVID because of the massive impact that we're seeing in just a short few months right now. One final slide I'll go through today just kind of walks through what our expectations are, what are the scenarios we're looking at. So here I show the length of economic recessions going back to the 1930s, and you can see the average recession is only about 11 months. Typically we're in an expansion. Typically we're in an expansion for much longer than we are in a downturn. You can see some of the downturns have been as short as 6 months there in the 1980 period, and several that are about 8 months. We're expecting this to be a shorter than average recession given current expectations. There's even a possibility that if we do see stronger growth here in the next 2 months, we're able to sustain that, that potentially the downturn could be determined to be over real quick. We could see this be the shortest economic downturn in U.S. history. But we're not ready to call that yet, and particularly because of all the uncertainty around the medical front. Mike and Jeff did a great job of walking us through that. There certainly is the potential for what we call a double dip or a W-shaped recovery coming out of this, where we see a little boost in the near term, we start to think we're coming out of it, and then unfortunately when you look ahead to the fall into the winter, we see a massive surge in the virus that causes most of the economies to slow down at least, or maybe shut down again. And particularly we see consumer activity pull back. We're concerned about that if we do see a spike in virus cases, that consumer activity is going to pull back again, and that's really going to slow the economy. And if that downside scenario does occur, we would certainly expect to see this downturn extend into next year and potentially make this at least as long as average for a downturn, but potentially even a little longer than that, depending on how long these medical issues stick with us. So fortunately, that's still a downside scenario. I think it's still lower odds in our opinions, and then a recovery that occurs a little quicker and we see things bounce back here in the second half of the year. But we're certainly keeping a very close eye on that uncertainty and what that means for the economy and especially for financial markets as well. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Randy Kay, and we'll try to handle any questions that have come up during the course of either presentation here.
Thank you so much, Ben. Fascinating information, and appreciate your analysis. One of the questions we received from one of our attendees, do you believe federal infrastructure spending could drive construction, which could then drive all of our sectors to rebound?
It could certainly help. I think when you look at an infrastructure spending, that's one of the fiscal stimulus efforts that is, I would say, most well received by economists. Because it does create a lot of jobs and does create a lot of boost in sectors that don't normally get a big boost from spending. Usually you see a lot of things happen in the service sector because people are given money like we saw earlier this year. I would be in favor of an infrastructure spending. I think that would help boost certain segments of the construction sector. As I said already, we're actually pretty positive on at least home construction already. We think that the housing sector will bounce back and could bounce back quite strongly. And then certainly an infrastructure spending bill that would go along with that would help us come out of this a little faster as well.
Could any or all of you speak to the role of child care services and how that's going to impact, where we're headed with both the economy and the recovery?
I'll go ahead and chime in. I mean, one of the things that we talk about on our team is, we joke, say the biggest child care service is schools. Will schools be opened up, and how are school districts going to approach the upcoming school year? We know that from a virus perspective, children are not as nearly severely affected by this virus, which is a great thing, as we see with like other respiratory viruses like flu, which are hard on kids. So there is some risk mitigation, and it gives you a little more confidence to be able to operate a facility, whether it's a school or child care services, that there is less danger in these younger kids. Now, that doesn't mean they can't transmit and they can't get it. It's just that the outcomes are less. And there are still mixed messages on how transmittable it is from children to their caregivers, their parents, their grandparents that are home, who are much higher risk. So there's still a lot of things to think about from a health policy perspective. And I'll let Ben talk about the economic side.
Yeah, certainly one of the things we're keeping a close eye on. I think everyone's been asking us, how much are we going to change because of this on how we work and how we operate? And I think we will for sure. We've seen several large companies that have come out and said they're more open to work from home, and we see a lot of push towards that. And I think there was already some shifting towards that, and this event's going to push that even further. As far as childcare, we do know that having childcare available really helps enable people to work, and having that not available just further constrains the recovery that we can have from this. So the more ability for us to either have schools open and or have childcare open, that this helps enable the recovery to take off a little faster than it is so far.
Great. I appreciate that response. Also, if you could speak to kind of any of the information you have related to unemployment and whether it's gender-based or split down the middle or what you're seeing, that would be great.
So we are seeing, unfortunately, I haven't looked too much into the gender breakout. I think it's been relatively down the middle across there, although obviously, getting back to the child care question, usually the burden for taking care of children is falling more on the female workers than it is the male workers. But I would say that the breakout we've clearly noticed is that the higher paid workers, or at least the higher skilled workers, as we call them, have not seen nearly as much declines in jobs. Certainly there's been some, but most of those people have been able to adapt. They're in jobs, or they are able to work from home. You can see the three of us sitting in our homes right now, reflective of that the higher skilled workers have been able to stay at home. It's been more the lower skilled workers, the lower paid workers, especially in the service sector, that have really taken the hit from this. And that's been the big importance of making sure that we're continuing to provide those unemployment benefits. Right now, the $600 a week extra benefit that the CARES Act provided will sunset at the end of July. We'll see what happens between now and then, whether we're able to either get that extended or amended. But still, we've seen 20 million people right now are still taking advantage of unemployment benefits, presumably most of them because they're unable to get a job. And that's really what's going to help hold the sectors of the economy that have struggled with this more so than the ones who haven't.
Thank you. I do want to recognize several of the agencies and partners that are online right now. We have representatives from Fresno County, Nevada County, Solano County, also from San Mateo and Contra Costa counties. I also want to recognize that we have a participant from, I believe, the City of Oakland and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. So really appreciate all of these different entities, listening in. I invite all of you to write in any questions you have that are specific to your agency and how you're interpreting and reflecting on the expert advice we're getting here today. And with that, I also want to ask our expert panelists, how do you foresee local government kind of providing the most kind of essential services right now to the constituents that they serve? Any suggestions on kind of, how to stay the course or how to kind of help provide kind of supports and services given the information you've been able to convey, both from a medical or workforce development or economic standpoint?
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, from a economic standpoint, it's really going to focus on training. I think you're going to see a lot of folks that are going to have a lot of trouble getting back into the workforce because the jobs that they had aren't there anymore. And I think training's been something that people need for a long time, and getting into shifting their sectors and those sort of things. So any way that local governments can help those people, besides just obviously the near term needing, you know, services and funding to be able to stay afloat. But I think when you look long term, there's going to be a big need for extra training and moving people out of certain sectors into others where the opportunities are.
Great.
I think it's a tough answer on the.
Go ahead.
I think it's a tough answer on the health side. There's not been many places globally that have figured out how to walk this balance between, you know, welding everybody inside of apartment buildings and letting commerce happen. I would say providing personal protective equipment to people that can't go out and get disposable masks or something like that would be a big help. Obviously, there is some benefit to that, even if it's not foolproof, and then just doing whatever is possible to allow people to social distance.
All right. Thank you, Ben and Jeff. Appreciate that. Mike, I wasn't sure if you wanted to share something, but please do if you want. Okay. Forgive me. I just want to make sure if you have any last minute questions, feel free to write them in. And we are looking at close to the end of the hour, so I want to make sure we have some information for our audience to take home. There is a handout of the slide deck attached here to the GoToWebinar platform. You will receive that. And if you want to stay connected with the team from American Century, Nationwide, or CSAC Finance Corporation, please reach out to Mike Jackson, Steve Ebert, or Jim Manker. And with that, I also invite you to stay informed by connecting with the Institute for Local Government. We're on social media, and we have a newsletter that goes out monthly. And I have one last poll I'd like to invite our attendees to take part in. And this will help us deliver future trainings or services to your organization in partnership with experts like the ones you heard today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. Would you be interested in receiving support through additional webinars? Would you prefer to receive written materials that would help your council or board? Would you like to have direct training or capacity building support for your agency? All right, responses are coming in. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and close that poll. And it looks like it's kind of across the board. Everyone's about interested in both webinars as well as written materials, and then some of your agencies are looking for direct training and capacity building support. Appreciate that information. Most of all, appreciate that your teams were able to join us today. Want to particularly thank our colleagues and experts at both American Century and Nationwide for bringing this incredible presentation with both analysis of the kind of current medical and industry needs, as well as the economic forecast and where things are headed. This was very informative and very, very helpful as we all think about planning for the future as local government professionals. So I thank you for that. And if Jim is on the line, I welcome you to say a last few parting words.
Yes, this is Jim Manker again with CSAC Finance Corporation. Thanks again to Nationwide and their partnership with California counties. We also thank you, Randy K. Stevens and the Institute for Local Government. Thank you for your help today. Everybody be safe out there, and let's keep looking for that vaccination, right, Jeff? All right, take care.
Hope so. Better than 6 years.
Thank you to everyone for participating, and thank you to our partners and experts at both Nationwide and American Century, and of course CSAC. Appreciate you all. Thank you.